Chrissy watched as her 6-year-old son's breath came out in short puffs in the cold winter air. At least Josh had his jacket on, the one he'd been given at the shelter in the autumn. It had been too big on him then. Now the sleeves were too short and it was a little tight across the shoulders. But maybe it would last through winter. Please, just last a little longer. Honey, it's time to go find breakfast now. Josh obediently opened the door of the van they'd slept in last night and stepped out into the frost-covered lot. The white 72 Chevy van was roomy in the back, and no one ever bothered them here in the abandoned salvage yard. It was home, even if it was near freezing on these late February nights. Just a few more weeks, spring would be here, and the weather and maybe her job prospects would get better. Chrissy and Josh began walking to their favorite restaurant. The buffet breakfast served each morning consisted of juicy sausage patties, lean strips of crispy bacon, golden hash browns, fluffy yellow scrambled eggs, buttered toast, and fresh fruit. A mountain of food was prepared each day, and Chrissy knew from experience that this was the most popular place to eat breakfast early in the mornings. But instead of heading for the entrance, she and Josh turned the corner in the alley to find the dumpster. The dining room leftovers were carried out every 15 or 20 minutes, and all they had to do was pick through as much warm leftover food as they wanted. They could graze for an hour or so as long as they stayed out of sight. She'd brought a backpack for extra that she would save if needed for the rest of today's meals. This morning, however, she noticed a couple of new people waiting for the next trash bag to come out of the dining room. Usually there was plenty for the 5 or 6 individuals who showed up for a meal. She knew some of them by name. Most were men who hadn't worked in a while, but who had families they needed to take food to. Everyone was always so careful not to mess this up for the others. If the manager became too irritated, he'd call the police, and a lot of people could go hungry. The back door to the restaurant opened. A busboy came out with a couple of trash bags, deposited them in the dumpster, and hustled back into the warm building. Chrissy and the others waited for about 10 seconds, then headed to the dumpster. A couple of the men were already arguing. "You've been here for an hour and had your fill. Let's take turns, We all got kids who gotta eat too." That was Merle, and his word usually was obeyed. But the new guys didn't know that yet. One of them, Bo, was objecting that he hadn't even got any of the food that came out the last 2 trips. Merle reached out, took him by the collar, and shook him roughly a couple of times. "Looky you, all of us only got about 20 minutes until the next boy comes out that door. We got families to feed right now. We let you take your turn, and there's still plenty more coming out the next 2 hours or so. What say you let the young lady and her little boy get them some breakfast before it gets too cold for any of us to eat?" He nodded at Chrissy, who gave him a grateful smile and immediately started going through the first bag. She found 4 untouched sausage patties right away, then a couple pieces of toast. Josh liked the hash browns the best, and that took another minute of going through the pile to find one that hadn't been covered with ketchup or less appetizing condiments. Finally, she stepped back and looked at Merle, who gave her a wink. "See you tomorrow, Merle. Thank you so much." She and Josh ate their breakfast while she walked him to school. He'd have a nice hot school lunch, at least, and she'd have what she saved from breakfast, unless she could find some samples at the grocery store again. But she couldn't count on that, and the city only had one soup kitchen that served one meal each day, usually dinner after 5 p.m. The sign said it was served late so that no one had to go to bed hungry, and she and Josh depended on that meal. Chrissy used to get food stamps, a government program for low-income families. But when she lost the apartment, she was afraid that without a proper place to live, the government might try to take Josh away from her before she could get back on her feet. That's when they started scrounging. In the months since they'd been sleeping in the van, she'd applied to job after job, interviewed for several, but hadn't been able to find a day job that would work around Josh's school hours. This morning, she had plans to go to the city library again, look at the newspapers, and use the free computers to look for jobs nearby. It was only 15 blocks away, and she could rest for a while before going to the grocery store to check out free samples and to the park for lunch. After lunch, she would be looking for aluminum cans that she could cash in for a little extra money and go by the local thrift store dumpster for free clothes and other items they'd thrown away. She'd found a pair of earrings recently, in an overlooked jeans pocket. She'd worn them to a job interview on Tuesday, and on Wednesday she'd sold them at a pawn store for $10. While walking to the library, she had a lot of time to think. She'd had so much time to think lately, and that wasn't always a good thing. Before the divorce, she'd never thought about much beyond her narrow, sheltered world. If she were driving to the store and a man came up to offer to wash her car windows at the stoplight, she never talked to him, tried not to make eye contact, and never thought about what his day-to-day life must be like. Now, she was all too aware of all of those things. When her husband William had left, he'd moved out of the state for another job and abandoned both her and his son. He hadn't sent money like he'd promised. In fact, she hadn't heard from him since the day she received the divorce papers. With no work experience, no friends, no savings, she'd only had until the end of the month to figure something out. The landlord took pity on her and let her stay an extra month. But once the utilities were turned off for non-payment, he told her she'd have to find another place or he was required to call child welfare on her. So she went to talk to the manager of the women's shelter, told her what happened and how they had no place to go. She and Josh stayed there for a month, with her looking for work and not finding anything, until the shelter told her it had a 5-week limit and she needed to make other arrangements. So she'd made up a story about calling her sister to come get her, packed up their belongings, and found the van to sleep in. Some days she was so discouraged, she thought she couldn't go on. But every time she picked up Josh from school and heard his excited chatter about a new thing he'd learned that day, or about his friends, she felt better. At least he didn't seem affected by their situation, she thought. As long as he could have a happy childhood, she reassured herself. Maybe she wasn't a total failure at being a parent. She tried to remind herself now, walking to the library, of how much she'd learned about how to survive. Sometimes she was amazed when she remembered how many things she'd owned when she was married. Really, all a person needed to live was pretty basic stuff: air, food, water, clothes. Everything else was just extra: a home, electricity, running water, heat, a car. She remembered that last year, during summer, there was a game that she and Josh had played. They had gone to the park after William had gone to work one morning. Josh liked to play in the park, and he especially liked to play Let's Pretend games. So she'd thought of a new one. It was called Let's Pretend We're Homeless. She'd ask, if we were homeless, what would we do? Where would we go? What would that be like? Well, now she didn't have to wonder anymore. She was living that pretend game, only it wasn't pretend anymore. It never ended. And at the end of the day, they didn't have a nice, snug house to go home to. Being homeless was her life now, and if she didn't find a way to make it change soon, her son might have to grow up on the streets. She smiled grimly. She could either choose to stay where she was or create a new and better future for herself and her son. With renewed determination, she opened the door to the library, breathed in deeply the scent of books and leather, and hope.